Wyoming Territory, 1878. The dying light of sunset painted Devil's Pass in shades of crimson and gold, but Hayes Jordan noticed none of it. His eyes were fixed instead on the horizon, searching for any sign of movement against the vast emptiness. 24 years old and already carrying more scars than most men twice his age, Hayes had learned early that the frontier offered no mercy to those foolish enough to expect it. "Keep moving," he muttered to himself, adjusting the worn Stetson that shaded his face. The late summer heat pressed against his skin, and his chestnut horse shifted restlessly beneath him. Though blessed with the kind of rugged good looks that turned heads in every settlement he passed through, strong jaw, clear blue eyes, and a frame hardened by years of riding, Hayes kept his distance from the townspeople, particularly the women. The West had taught him one lesson above all others. Attachment was a luxury he couldn't afford. Every person he'd ever allowed close had been ripped away by the unforgiving land or the violence that plagued it. His parents to fever, his brother to outlaws, his mentor to a stray bullet. At 24, Hayes had already resolved that his path would be walked alone. Safer that way. Cleaner. No messy goodbyes, no fresh graves to dig. Lone wolves survive, he reminded himself, the mantra that had carried him through 6 years of drifting. The stubble on his face was light, just a day or two worth of growth that he'd shave once he reached town. His lean physique spoke to countless miles in the saddle and nights spent beneath stars rather than roofs. What Hayes wanted was simple enough. Earn enough at the upcoming cattle drive to buy a small tract of land far from everybody else. What he needed? Well, that wasn't something he allowed himself to consider anymore. The last crimson streaks faded from the sky as he approached Redemption Creek, a settlement that had sprung up around a silver mine and cattle trade. Lights from the saloon spilled onto the dusty main street, and the sound of a tinny piano floated through the night air. "Just supplies and information," he told his horse as they approached the hitching post. "Then we're gone by morning." The saloon doors swung open as a drunken cowpuncher stumbled out, nearly colliding with Hayes. The man muttered an apology before staggering down the street. Hayes watched him go, then tied his horse and stepped toward the establishment. That's when he heard it, a woman's cry, sharp and frightened, coming from the alley beside the general store. His hand instinctively moved to the colt at his hip as he changed direction, moving silently toward the sound. In the narrow space between buildings, 3 men had cornered a young woman. One held her wrist while another pawed at the reticule she clutched tightly to her chest. "Now, Miss Delacroix, be reasonable," the largest of them slurred. "Your pa owes us, and one way or another, we're collecting." "My father owes you nothing," the woman responded, her voice steady despite her obvious fear. "Now unhand me before I call the sheriff." Hayes should have walked away. Other people's troubles weren't his concern. He'd learned that lesson the hard way. But something in her voice stopped him, the courage beneath the fear, perhaps. Before he could reconsider, he stepped into the alley, his spurs announcing his presence with a soft jingle. "The lady asked you to let her go," he said quietly, his right hand resting casually on his holstered revolver. "I suggest you do as she says." The men turned, startled by the interruption. In the dim light spilling from a nearby window, Hayes could see the woman clearly for the first time. She couldn't have been older than 22, with honey blonde hair pinned neatly beneath a modest hat. Her dress was simple but well-made, deep blue calico that complemented her fair complexion. But it was her eyes that caught him, fierce and intelligent, more annoyed than frightened. "Mind your business, stranger," the leader growled, releasing the woman's arm to face Hayes. "This is between us and the Delacroix girl." Hayes didn't move. 3 men against 1 woman doesn't seem like fair odds to me. The leader took a step forward, revealing a knife at his belt. "Last chance to walk away, cowboy." Hayes sighed. That's the problem with this place. Nobody ever takes the easy way. What followed happened so quickly that the woman barely had time to gasp. Hayes drew and fired in one fluid motion, his bullet striking the wooden crate beside the leader's head. The shot echoed between the buildings as the man stumbled backward in shock. "Next one won't miss," Hayes said calmly. "Now clear out before I decide this town would be better off without you." The men needed no further encouragement, scrambling past him and out of the alley. When they were gone, Hayes holstered his weapon and turned to the woman, keeping a respectful distance. "Are you hurt, ma'am?" She straightened her hat, studying him with a gaze that seemed to take his measure in an instant. No, thanks to you. Though I had the situation well in hand. Hayes couldn't help the small smile that tugged at his lips. I can see that. My apologies for interfering. Willa, she said suddenly. Willa Delacroix. She extended a gloved hand, a gesture so civilized it seemed out of place in the rough frontier town. After a moment's hesitation, Hayes took it briefly. Hayes Jordan. Well, Mr. Jordan, it seems I owe you my gratitude, if not my life. Her voice carried the slight refinement of Eastern education, but there was something unmistakably Western in her direct gaze. Those men work for Edmund Holloway. He's been trying to force my father to sell our land for months. Dangerous situation, Hayes commented, already regretting his involvement. Conflicts over land and money were exactly the kind of entanglements he avoided. Perhaps you'll allow me to buy you a meal as thanks? My father owns the hotel across the street. Her offer was delivered with a confidence that suggested she wasn't accustomed to rejection. That's not necessary, Hayes replied, taking a step back. I'm just passing through, leaving at first light. Something flickered in her expression. Disappointment, perhaps, or simply assessment. Then a hot meal before your journey is even more important. I insist. Before he could protest further, she moved past him toward the street, pausing to look back when he didn't immediately follow. Coming, Mr. Jordan? Or do you prefer to stand in dark alleys alone? Hayes knew he should decline, knew that involvement of any kind only led to complications. But his stomach rumbled traitorously, reminding him that he hadn't eaten since dawn, and something about her challenging expression made it impossible to simply walk away. One meal, he conceded, falling into step beside her. And then we're square. Of course, she agreed, though the smile that curved her lips suggested she had other ideas. Whatever you say. As they crossed the moonlit street, Hayes felt an unsettling awareness that his carefully maintained isolation had just been breached. Whatever happened next, he sensed that Willa Delacroix was not someone easily dismissed or forgotten. The Delacroix Hotel stood 3 stories tall, a testament to someone's belief that Redemption Creek would grow beyond its current boundaries. Inside, the dining room was nearly empty, most patrons having finished their evening meal hours ago. A graying man looked up from behind the front desk, his expression brightening at the sight of Willa. There you are? I was beginning to worry. His eyes shifted to Hayes, narrowing slightly. And who might this be? Father, this is Mr. Hayes Jordan. He just saved me from an unpleasant encounter with Holloway's men. Willa removed her gloves, placing them in her reticule. I've invited him to dinner as thanks. Joseph Delacroix studied Hayes for a moment before extending his hand. Then it seems I owe you my gratitude as well, sir. Please, make yourself comfortable. I'll have Martha prepare something right away. Hayes nodded awkwardly, uncomfortable with the attention. It wasn't anything special. Nonsense, Willa said, leading him to a table near the fireplace. He drew faster than anyone I've ever seen, father. One moment Holloway's man was threatening me, and the next, she mimed the quick draw with delicate hands. You've had experience with firearms, her father observed, his tone neutral. Hayes shrugged. Some. Mr. Jordan is a man of few words, Willa added, a hint of amusement in her voice. But considerable action. The conversation paused as Martha, a matronly woman with kind eyes, brought out plates of roast beef, potatoes, and fresh bread. Hayes realized just how hungry he was as the aroma reached him, and for several minutes, he focused solely on his food. Are you in town for the cattle drive? Joseph asked eventually, joining them at the table with a cup of coffee. Holloway's bringing a herd through next week. No, sir. Just passing through, Hayes replied between bites. Heading north. Alone? Willa asked, her fork paused halfway to her lips. When Hayes nodded, she frowned slightly. That's Indian country. Dangerous for a solitary rider. I can handle myself. Hayes had no intention of sharing his actual destination or purpose. The less they knew, the better for everyone. Like you handled Holloway's men? Her eyes held a challenge that Hayes found oddly compelling. Even the best gunman can't outshoot an arrow in the back. Willa, her father cautioned, don't pester our guest. It's not pestering to be concerned for someone's welfare, father. She turned back to Hayes. We have a wagon train leaving for Fort Laramie in 2 days. Safe passage, good company, and fair wages if you're willing to help guard it. Hayes set down his fork, studying her. Why would you offer work to a stranger? For all you know, can't prove it. But the timing was convenient for him. The older man sighed. We're just trying to hold on to what's ours until the law catches up with progress out here. It was a familiar story, one Hayes had deliberately avoided entangling himself in. Yet as he followed Joseph upstairs to a small but clean room, the first real bed he'd seen in weeks, he found himself considering the offer more seriously than he should have. Perhaps it was exhaustion, or perhaps it was the memory of Willa's challenging gaze. But as Hayes stretched out on the mattress, boots kicked off and hat hung on the bedpost, he couldn't shake the feeling that Redemption Creek might delay his journey more than he'd planned. Just until the wagon train, he muttered to the ceiling. Then back to the plan. But even as sleep claimed him, a small voice in his mind wondered if plans, like promises, were made to be broken. Morning arrived with golden lights streaming through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Hayes woke instantly, his hand reflexively reaching for the revolver he kept beneath his pillow. The unfamiliar surroundings momentarily disoriented him before memory returned. Redemption Creek, the Delacroix Hotel, the offer of employment. After washing and shaving, he made his way downstairs to find the dining room busy with the breakfast trade. Willa moved efficiently between tables, delivering plates and coffee with practiced grace. When she spotted Hayes, she gestured toward an empty table in the corner. "Sleep well?" she asked, pouring coffee without waiting for his request. "Well enough." He glanced around the room, noting the mix of locals and travelers. "Busy place. Stagecoach comes through on Tuesdays and Fridays. These folks are heading east." She set down the coffee pot. "Eggs and bacon?" Hayes nodded, watching as she moved away. In the morning light, he could see that her hair was the color of summer wheat, pinned back practically, but with a few strands escaping around her face. Her dress was simpler than the previous evenings, a pale yellow calico with a practical apron tied around her waist. At 22, Willa Delacroix carried herself with the confidence of someone who knew exactly who she was and what she wanted, a rarity in a frontier where most were simply trying to survive from one day to the next. Hayes found himself wondering what had shaped that certainty in her. His thoughts were interrupted when she returned with a heaping plate of food. "Have you decided?" she asked, sliding it in front of him. "About the wagon train?" Hayes sipped his coffee, buying time. The sensible answer was still no. Keep moving, avoid entanglements, stick to his solitary path. But something about the earnestness in her expression made him hesitate. "What exactly would you expect me to do?" "Ride scout. Help guard the wagons, the usual." She sat across from him, surprising him with her directness. "Father says you're experienced with firearms. We need that. Holloway's men have been making things difficult for anyone trying to leave the valley without his permission. And why would he care about people leaving?" Willa leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Because we're carrying documents, survey maps and legal papers that prove he's been falsifying property lines. My father's been gathering evidence for months. If we can get them to the territorial governor in Cheyenne, Holloway's land grab falls apart." Hayes frowned. This was exactly the kind of complicated situation he avoided: land disputes, corrupt businessmen, potential violence over pieces of paper. Sounds like more trouble than $20 worth. 30, then, she countered immediately. "And we're not asking you to fight our battles. Just help us get to Fort Laramie safely. What happens after that is our concern." He studied her for a long moment, searching for signs of deception or manipulation. Instead, all he found was determination and a flicker of something that might have been desperation. "Why me? You could hire any gun hand passing through." "Because I saw how you handled yourself last night. You didn't kill when you could have. That shows judgment." Her eyes held his steadily. "And because you have nothing to gain by betraying us to Holloway." It was sound reasoning, which only made Hayes more wary. He'd maintained his freedom by avoiding exactly these kinds of entanglements. And yet, the prospect of traveling north with protection was practical. The extra money wouldn't hurt either. 2 days until departure? He asked finally. Willa nodded, hope brightening her expression. "Thursday at dawn." "I'll do it," Hayes said, surprising himself almost as much as her. "But I leave at Fort Laramie, regardless of what happens after." Her smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains, unexpected and briefly dazzling. "Agreed. I'll tell Father to add you to the roster." She stood, straightening her apron. "Thank you, Mr. Jordan. You won't regret it." As she hurried away, Hayes wondered if he already did. But there was something compelling about Willa Delacroix and her father's fight, a reminder of his own family's struggle against those who took what didn't belong to them. Just to Fort Laramie, he reminded himself firmly. Then back to the original plan. The next 2 days passed in a flurry of preparations. Hayes helped load wagons, check ammunition stores, and plan routes with Joseph Delacroix, who proved to be a meticulous organizer. The wagon train was modest, 4 wagons in total, carrying the Delacroix family and 3 other families who had decided the valley's future under Holloway's influence wasn't worth staying for. Hayes found himself impressed by the settlers' determination. Unlike many he'd encountered over the years, they weren't fleeing failure or chasing impossible dreams. They were standing on principle, refusing to be bullied off their rightful claims. Willa worked alongside everyone else, her practical nature evident in everything from inventory management to helping families decide what necessities to bring and what comforts to leave behind. Hayes found himself watching her more often than he should, noting the easy way she calmed frightened children or reassured worried mothers. On the evening before their departure, Hayes was checking his horse's shoes when Willa approached, carrying a package wrapped in brown paper. "For the journey," she explained, handing it to him. "Extra ammunition for your rifle. Father noticed you were running low." Hayes accepted the package with a nod of thanks. "That's thoughtful. We take care of our own," she replied simply. Then, after a moment's hesitation, "Have you always traveled alone, Mr. Jordan?" The personal question caught him off guard. "Long enough to prefer it that way." "That sounds lonely." There was no pity in her voice, just a simple observation. "Lonely is safer than the alternative," he responded, more honestly than he'd intended. "People who get close to me tend to end up dead." Instead of the expected sympathy, Willa tilted her head slightly, studying him. "That's quite an assumption. Do you believe you're cursed, Mr. Jordan, or just unlucky?" The directness of her question made him pause in his work. "Neither. Just realistic. The frontier isn't kind to attachments." "The frontier isn't kind to anyone," she countered. "That's why we form communities, build towns, help each other. No one survives alone forever." Hayes returned to checking his saddle straps, uncomfortable with her assessment. "I've managed so far. Surviving isn't the same as living." Willa's voice softened. "But I won't pester you further. We leave at dawn. Try to get some sleep." As she walked away, Hayes found himself staring after her, troubled by how easily she'd seen through the careful walls he'd built. Few people challenged his chosen solitude. Most respected the distance he maintained. But Willa Delacroix seemed determined to question everything he thought he knew about himself. Dawn arrived misty and cool, the sun not yet visible above the eastern horizon. The wagon train assembled at the edge of town, families making final adjustments to their loads and saying goodbyes to those staying behind. Hayes rode slightly apart, scanning the trail ahead and the surrounding hills for any sign of trouble. Willa approached on a sturdy bay mare, dressed practically in a split riding skirt and jacket, her hair braided and pinned beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "See anything concerning?" she asked, reining in beside him. Hayes shook his head. "Not yet, but Holloway knows you're leaving. The whole town knows. We haven't been secretive." She glanced back at the wagons. "Father thinks he'll wait until we're well away from town before making any trouble. Fewer witnesses that way." "Smart assessment," Hayes agreed. "I'll ride ahead, check the pass. That's where I'd set up if I were planning an ambush." Willa nodded, her expression serious. "Be careful. These aren't men who fight fair." "Neither am I," Hayes replied with a grim smile. "Get them moving. I'll find you before midday." He urged his horse forward, not waiting for her response. As he rode ahead of the wagon train, scanning the terrain with practiced eyes, Hayes reflected on the unusual position he found himself in. For 6 years, he'd avoided responsibility for anyone but himself. Now he was riding scout for a wagon train carrying families and documents that could determine the future of an entire valley. All because a woman with weak gold hair and challenging eyes had asked him to. The thought was unsettling enough that he pushed it aside, focusing instead on the task at hand. The trail ahead wound through increasingly rugged country, eventually narrowing as it approached Devil's Pass, the same route he'd taken into Redemption Creek days earlier. The rocky terrain offered numerous places for ambush, and Hayes proceeded cautiously, alert for any sign of movement. Halfway through the pass, he found what he was looking for, fresh horse droppings, cigarette butts, and the distinct impression of boots in the soft earth beside the trail. Someone had been watching. "There are two ways this ends," Hayes called out, his revolver trained steadily on the wounded men. "You ride away now, with holes that'll heal, or you push this further and leave in pine boxes. Your choice." The leader clutched his bleeding shoulder, his face contorted with rage and pain. "You're a dead man, Jordan. Holloway isn't here," Hayes interrupted. "And I'm getting tired of waiting for your decision." For a tense moment, Hayes thought they might choose the harder path. Then the second man urged his horse forward, hissing at his companion. "Come on, Frank. He could have killed us if he wanted to. Let's go." Reluctantly, the leader turned his horse, fixing Hayes with a hateful glare. "This isn't over." "It never is," Hayes replied evenly. "Tell Holloway if he wants to stop that wagon train, he'll need to come himself. And bring more men." He watched as they rode away, waiting until they disappeared around a bend before exhaling slowly. The confrontation had been risky. He'd gambled that wounding them would send a stronger message than killing them outright. But he'd also revealed his willingness to fight, which meant Holloway would indeed send more men next time. Hayes turned his horse and galloped back toward the wagon train. They needed to move quickly now, before Holloway could organize a larger force. He found the wagons making steady progress along the trail, Willa riding alongside her father's vehicle. Her expression brightened when she spotted him, then immediately sobered as she noted his urgency. "Trouble?" she asked as he reined in beside her. "Holloway's men, two of them, watching the pass." He kept his voice low to avoid alarming the others. "I persuaded them to leave, but they'll be back with reinforcements." Joseph Delacroix frowned from his seat on the wagon. "Did you have to fire that gun of yours?" "Yes," Hayes answered without apology. "They made their intentions clear." "Are they dead?" Willa asked, her voice steady despite the gravity of the question. "Wounded. I don't kill unless I have to." He glanced back at the trail behind them. "But they'll report back to Holloway. We need to clear the pass before they return in force." Joseph nodded grimly. "We'll pick up the pace. There's a defensible campsite about 5 miles beyond the pass. We can reach it by nightfall if we push." As the wagons increased their speed, Willa remained beside Hayes, studying him with an expression he couldn't quite decipher. "What?" he finally asked. "You wounded them instead of killing them," she observed. "Most hired guns wouldn't show such restraint." Hayes shrugged uncomfortably. "I'm not a hired gun, and killing brings complications I prefer to avoid. Like guilt." There was no judgment in her tone, only curiosity. "Like attention," he corrected. "Dead men have friends and family who ask questions. Wounded men tell stories that make others think twice." A practical approach. Willa adjusted her hat against the strengthening sun. "Though I suspect there's more to it than that." Before Hayes could respond, a shout came from the lead wagon. The left wheel had struck a rock, breaking several spokes and bringing the vehicle to a halt. The delay couldn't have come at a worse time, with Holloway's reinforcements likely already on their way. For the next hour, Hayes worked alongside the men to repair the damaged wheel, constantly scanning the trail behind them for signs of pursuit. The women and children gathered water from a nearby stream, refilling canteens and water skins. As Hayes helped secure the repaired wheel, he found Willa working beside him, her sleeves rolled up and hands dirty from the effort. "You're good with your hands," he observed, surprised by her practical knowledge. "This isn't my first wagon train," she replied, tightening a bolt with surprising strength. "Father and I came west when I was 16. Mother had died the year before, and there was nothing keeping us in Boston." The personal revelation surprised Hayes. Boston to Wyoming Territory is quite a change. It was his dream. Open a hotel in a growing frontier town, be part of building something new. A shadow crossed her face. He didn't count on men like Holloway trying to steal what others have built. "Few do," Hayes agreed quietly. "The frontier attracts dreamers and predators alike." "And which are you, Mr. Jordan?" Willa asked, her eyes meeting his directly. The question hung between them, unexpectedly personal. Hayes found himself wanting to give her a real answer, though he wasn't entirely sure what that might be. "Neither," he finally said. "Just a man passing through." Something like disappointment flickered in her expression. "I think there's more to you than that, but you're not ready to admit it yet." Before he could respond, Joseph called for everyone to resume their positions. The wheel was fixed, and they needed to make up for lost time. Willa gave Hayes one last unreadable look before returning to her father's wagon. The caravan continued its journey, clearing the pass by mid-afternoon without further sign of Holloway's men. The absence of pursuit made Hayes increasingly uneasy. Experienced predators often let their prey believe they've escaped before striking. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, the wagons reached the defensible site Joseph had mentioned, a natural hollow surrounded by rock formations that would shield their campfires from distant observation and provide cover in case of attack. "We'll set watches through the night," Hayes instructed as the families began making camp. 2 men at a time, rotating every 2 hours. Joseph nodded agreement. "I'll take first watch with Samuel," he said, indicating one of the other family patriarchs. "You should rest while you can, Jordan. You've had a long day." Hayes knew the older man was right, but the persistent sense of danger kept him alert as darkness fell over the camp. Families gathered around small fires, cooking simple meals and speaking in hushed tones. Children were quickly bedded down in wagons while adults lingered, cleaning weapons and discussing the day's events. Unable to settle, Hayes circled the perimeter one more time before finally accepting a plate of beans and salt pork from Martha, the Delacroix's cook who had joined their wagon train. "Eat," she instructed firmly. "Can't protect anyone if you fall off your horse from hunger." Hayes nodded his thanks and found a relatively secluded spot at the edge of the firelight. He was halfway through his meal when Willa appeared beside him, carrying a tin cup of coffee. "Thought you might need this," she said, offering it to him. "You've barely stopped moving since dawn." He accepted the cup gratefully, the warmth seeping through his chilled fingers. "Force of habit. I don't like staying in one place too long." "Because of the people who end up dead around you?" Her directness still had the power to surprise him. When he didn't immediately respond, she continued more gently. "I'm sorry. That was presumptuous of me. But not inaccurate," Hayes admitted reluctantly. "I've buried enough people to last several lifetimes." Willa settled beside him, her own cup cradled in her hands. "We've all lost people out here. It's the nature of the frontier." This was different. The words came unbidden, drawn out by the quiet night and her patient presence. "My family had a small ranch in Montana Territory. Nothing special, just enough to get by. Then gold was discovered on neighboring land, and suddenly our water rights became valuable." He took a sip of coffee, the bitter taste matching the memory. "Men came, offered to buy us out. My father refused. 2 weeks later, he and my mother were dead. Influenza, they called it. Though folks get suspicious when an entire family falls ill overnight. My brother and I survived, barely." Willa remained silent, her eyes reflecting the dancing flames of the campfire. "We rebuilt, the two of us. Thought we were safe." Hayes stared into the darkness beyond the camp. "We weren't. They came back, this time with no pretense of negotiation. Shot Jacob while he was mending fences. Would have got me too if I hadn't been in town that day." "How old were you?" Willa asked softly. 18. Old enough to want revenge, young enough to think I could get it. His jaw tightened at the memory. "I tracked them for months. Found the men who pulled the triggers, but never the ones who gave the orders." "Did killing them bring you peace?" There was no judgment in her question, only genuine curiosity. Hayes shook his head slowly. "It brought me nothing but more trouble. A price on my head in certain territories, a reputation I never wanted. Eventually I figured out that staying in motion was safer than stopping anywhere long enough to form attachments. And yet here you are, helping a wagon train of strangers." Her voice held a gentle challenge. "Temporary arrangement," he reminded her, "and one I'm already beginning to question." Willa studied him for a long moment. "I think you want to believe people are dangerous to care about, because it's easier than admitting you're afraid of losing them." The observation struck uncomfortably close to truth, making Hayes shift restlessly. "You're very direct, Miss Delacroix." "Willa," she corrected. "And yes, I am. Life's too short, and the West too dangerous for games and pretense." A shout from the perimeter interrupted their conversation. Joseph, calling for Hayes. He was on his feet instantly, hand on his revolver as he moved toward the sound. "Riders approaching," Joseph explained tersely when Hayes reached him. "At least 6, moving slowly. No torches." Hayes nodded, eyes scanning the darkness. "They're trying to approach quietly. Wake the others, but no lights. Get everyone behind the rocks." As Joseph hurried to alert the camp, Hayes climbed to a higher vantage point, straining to see in the moonlight. The approaching riders were still some distance away, moving carefully along the trail the wagon train had followed. Willa appeared beside him. Hayes shook his head. Against those odds, with women and children to protect, fighting is a last resort. He studied the terrain, considering options. We need a distraction, something to make them think we've gone a different way. Understanding dawned in Willa's expression. A false trail. Exactly. Hayes was already moving, his mind racing through possibilities. Get 2 men with horses. We'll leave obvious tracks heading east, away from our actual route. With luck, they'll follow the decoy while we continue north under cover of darkness. The plan came together quickly. 2 of the younger men would ride east, creating a visible trail before circling back to rejoin the group by morning. Meanwhile, the wagons would continue north along a less obvious route, traveling through the night to put distance between themselves and their pursuers. As the camp hurriedly packed, dousing fires and preparing for immediate departure, Hayes found himself working alongside Willa, impressed by her efficiency and calm under pressure. "You've done this before," he observed as she helped a mother settle her sleeping children in a wagon. "Not this exactly," she admitted, "but crisis doesn't allow for panic. My father taught me that." Hayes nodded his understanding. Joseph Delacroix had proven himself a capable leader, maintaining calm authority even as danger approached. The resemblance between father and daughter extended beyond their wheat gold hair to a core of steady resolve. Within minutes, the decoy riders were away, their horses' hoofbeats deliberately heavy on the rocky ground. The wagons moved out shortly after, traveling without lanterns along a parallel route that would eventually rejoin the main trail miles ahead. Hayes rode point, while Joseph and another man brought up the rear. Willa drove her father's wagon, her back straight and her focus absolute as she navigated the difficult terrain in near darkness. The night passed in tense silence, broken only by the occasional creak of wagon wheels or the soft murmur of voices as parents soothed frightened children. Hayes remained hyper-alert, aware that their strategy would only work if Holloway's men took the bait and followed the false trail. Dawn found them several miles north of their original campsite, exhausted but safe for the moment. Hayes rode back along their trail, verifying they hadn't been followed, before returning to where the wagons had stopped to rest the teams and prepare a quick breakfast. "Any sign of them?" Joseph asked as Hayes dismounted. "None. I think they took the bait." Hayes accepted the cup of coffee Willa offered him, noting the shadows beneath her eyes. "You should rest. I can drive the wagon for a while." She shook her head. "I'm fine." "Did Davis and Young return yet?" "No, but they know to follow this trail. They'll catch up." Hayes sipped the coffee, surveying the tired travelers. "We should reach the river crossing by nightfall. After that, we're out of Holloway's usual territory." "Don't underestimate him," Joseph warned. "He has connections beyond the valley. If those documents are as damaging as we believe, he won't stop at the river." Hayes frowned. "What exactly do those papers contain?" Joseph and Willa exchanged a glance before the older man responded. "Proof that Holloway has been falsifying land records, intimidating claimants, and bribing territorial officials. Enough to ruin him if it reaches the governor. And you've been collecting this evidence. How?" "People talk," Willa said simply, "especially to their hotel keeper. And I've been keeping careful records of every conversation, every complaint, every suspicious death or disappearance in the valley for the past 2 years." Hayes stared at her with new understanding. "You've been building a case all this time. That's why he's so determined to stop you." Joseph nodded grimly. "Holloway discovered what we were doing a month ago when one of his men overheard a conversation. Since then, he's been trying to force us to sell the hotel and leave without our records." "Or not leave at all," Willa added quietly. The revelation added a new dimension to Hayes's understanding of their situation. This wasn't just about land or money. It was about justice for an entire community. The Delacroix weren't running. They were fighting back in the only way they could. "Where are these documents now?" Hayes asked, suddenly aware of their critical importance. Willa tapped her boot meaningfully. "Sewn into my skirt lining, several hiding places in the wagon, and some with each of the other families. If one of us is caught, the others can still get through." The thoroughness of their planning impressed Hayes. These weren't naive Easterners stumbling into frontier conflict. They were determined fighters using strategy instead of bullets. "Smart," he acknowledged. but it also means everyone in this train is a target. We all knew the risks when we agreed to carry the evidence, Joseph said firmly. Every family here has suffered under Holloway's grip. Before Hayes could respond, a shout came from one of the men on watch. Two riders were approaching fast from the south, Davis and Young, the decoy riders, pushing their horses hard. Trouble, Hayes muttered, moving to meet them. The men reined in their lathered horses, both looking exhausted and grim. They didn't fall for it, Davis reported between gasping breaths. Split their forces, 4 followed us, but at least 6 continued on the main trail. There may be 2 hours behind us. Joseph's expression hardened. How heavily armed? Rifles, revolvers. One had what looked like a scattergun. Young dismounted, patting his heaving horse. They mean business, Mr. Delacroix. Hayes turned to study the terrain ahead. The relatively open country offered little in the way of defensive positions or hiding places. Their only advantage was knowledge of their own route. We push for the river, he decided. Hard as the teams can manage. If we reach the crossing before them, we'll have a defensive position and can hold them off while the wagons ford. No one argued with his assessment. Within minutes, the wagons were moving again, drivers pushing the teams as much as they dared on the rough terrain. Hayes rode ahead, scouting the trail and searching for any sign of additional threats. As the sun climbed higher, the heat became oppressive. Children grew cranky, adults tense with fatigue and worry. Hayes found himself riding back frequently to check on their progress, his concern for their safety growing with each passing hour. During one such return, he found Willa's wagon lagging slightly, one of the wheel horses showing signs of distress. He's overheated, she explained as Hayes rode alongside. I've been giving him water, but he needs rest. Hayes examined the animal with a practiced eye. He'll collapse if pushed much further. We need to redistribute the load. Working quickly, they transferred some of the wagon's contents to the others, lightening the burden on the struggling team. As they worked, Hayes found himself aware of Willa in a way that went beyond professional concern. The determined set of her jaw, the gentle way she spoke to the distressed horse, the strength in her slender arms as she lifted heavy crates. You didn't have to come back, she observed as they finished. You could have stayed ahead with the scouts. Hayes shrugged. Wouldn't be much of a guide if I left you all behind. Is that all you are to us? A guide? Her direct gaze challenged him. The question caught him off guard. What was he to these people, to her? Not quite a friend, more than a hired hand. The undefined nature of his position made him uncomfortable. For now, he answered carefully. Until Fort Laramie. Something like disappointment flickered in her eyes, but she nodded acceptance. Of course. Fort Laramie. They continued their journey in silence, the tension between them unresolved but set aside in the face of more immediate concerns. By mid-afternoon, Hayes could see the line of trees that marked the river's course, still distant, but a visible goal to work toward. Their progress, however, had slowed significantly. The teams were exhausted, the travelers equally so. Hayes knew they wouldn't reach the river before their pursuers caught up. A decision needed to be made. He rode back to Joseph's wagon. We need to consider our options, he said without preamble. At this pace, Holloway's men will overtake us before we reach the river. Joseph wiped sweat from his brow. What do you suggest? The families continue toward the river while a few of us stay behind to delay the pursuit, Hayes proposed. A small group can move faster if trouble approaches and might draw their focus away from the wagons. A diversion, Joseph nodded slowly. Risky, but it might work. Who would stay? Myself and perhaps 2 others, volunteers only. Hayes glanced toward the horizon behind them. We'd rejoin you at the river if possible, or at Fort Laramie, if necessary. Joseph studied him thoughtfully. You're proposing to put yourself at considerable risk for people you barely know, Mr. Jordan. That doesn't align with your reputation for avoiding entanglements. Hayes shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. Sometimes circumstances change. Or people do, Joseph suggested quietly. His gaze flicked briefly toward Willa's wagon before returning to Hayes. Very well. I'll ask for volunteers, but I won't be among them. My place is with my daughter. Hayes nodded, relieved. The thought of Joseph Delacroix facing Holloway's men had been concerning. The older man was brave, but not a fighter by nature. As Joseph moved to speak with the other men, Willa approached, having evidently overheard at least part of their conversation. You're staying behind, she stated, her tone making it neither question nor accusation. "Someone needs to slow them down," Hayes replied simply. "And it has to be you?" There was an edge to her voice he hadn't heard before. "It's what I'm good at." He met her gaze steadily. The use of his first name, so casual yet intimate, caught him by surprise. Before he could respond, Joseph returned with Davis and Young, both of whom had volunteered to stay with Hayes. "The plan is set," Joseph announced. "The wagons continue to the river while you three create a diversion. We'll wait at the crossing until dawn tomorrow, then proceed if you haven't rejoined us." Hayes nodded, already formulating strategies. "We'll try to lead them east, away from your trail. If we succeed, they may not reach the river until you're already across." As the travelers prepared to continue their journey, Hayes found himself the recipient of handshakes and grateful words from people he'd known for less than 3 days. Their trust in him was humbling and unsettling in equal measure. Willa was the last to speak to him, approaching as he checked his rifle and ammunition one final time. "I have something for you," she said, holding out a small leather pouch. "Martha made extra journey bread. It should last a few days if needed." Hayes accepted the pouch, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. "Thank you for this and everything. Don't make me regret trusting you." "Hayes Jordan," she said softly, "come back to us." Before he could formulate a response, she turned and walked back to her wagon. Hayes watched her go, struck by the realization that for the first time in years he had promised, however implicitly, to return to someone. The wagons departed, continuing their northward journey toward the river, while Hayes, Davis, and Young prepared for their diversion. The plan was simple but risky. They would wait until Holloway's men were visible, then make themselves seen before leading the pursuers on a chase eastward, away from the wagon train's actual route. "Remember," Hayes instructed his companions as they concealed themselves behind a rock formation, "our goal is to draw them away, not engage in a firefight. We ride fast, stay just visible enough to keep them following, but don't let them get close enough for accurate shooting." Both men nodded their understanding. They were ranchers, not gunfighters, but they handled their weapons with the competence of men who had grown up on the frontier. They didn't have to wait long. Within an hour, riders appeared on the southern horizon, moving at a steady pace along the wagon train's trail. Hayes counted 8 men, more than they'd anticipated. "They've consolidated their forces," he murmured. "That's good for the wagons. Means they're all following us, but makes our job harder." "What's the signal?" Young asked, his voice steady despite the danger. "When they're close enough to identify us, but not close enough for accurate rifle fire." Hayes checked his revolver one last time. "Ready your horses. We'll need every bit of speed they can give." As Holloway's men drew nearer, Hayes studied their formation and equipment. They were well-armed and riding good horses, professional troublemakers rather than casual hands. At their head rode a man Hayes didn't recognize, distinguished by a long duster coat despite the heat. Holloway himself? Davis wondered, following Hayes's gaze. Possibly. Or his right hand. Hayes tensed as the riders came within the planned distance. "Get ready now." The 3 men mounted their horses and rode deliberately into view, making sure they were spotted before turning eastward and spurring their mounts to a gallop. Behind them came shouts and the sound of pursuit. The bait had been taken. For the next 2 hours, they led Holloway's men on a chase through increasingly rough country, staying just far enough ahead to maintain the pursuit while conserving their horses' strength. Occasionally, rifle shots rang out behind them, but the distance made accuracy impossible. As the sun began to set, Hayes signaled for them to separate, each taking a different route, but all continuing generally eastward. The strategy worked. Holloway's group split to follow them, spreading their forces thinner. Hayes pushed his horse up a rocky incline, gaining higher ground where he could observe the pursuit. 3 riders had followed him, including the man in the duster coat. The others had divided between Davis and Young, exactly as he'd hoped. Night fell, making pursuit more difficult but not impossible in the clear, moonlit landscape. Hayes continued eastward for another hour before doubling back, using terrain and darkness to lose his followers. By midnight, he was reasonably certain he'd shaken them and began making his way cautiously back toward the river crossing. He reached the riverbank shortly before dawn, tired but satisfied with the success of their plan. The wagon train had indeed made it across. He could see the remains of their campfires on the far side and wagon tracks leading away northward. They hadn't waited until dawn as agreed, suggesting they'd crossed immediately upon reaching the river and continued through the night. A wise decision, Hayes thought, but one that left him uncertain about Davis and Young. Had they also made it back? Were they across already, or still evading pursuit? As he studied the crossing point, considering his options, movement on the far bank caught his attention. A single figure emerged from the tree line, leading a horse down to the water's edge. Even in the pre-dawn light, Hayes recognized the silhouette immediately. Willa. She had waited for them while the others continued on, a dangerous choice that sent a complicated mixture of emotions through Hayes's exhausted mind. Relief that someone had stayed, concern for her safety, and something deeper he wasn't ready to name. He urged his tired horse forward, splashing into the shallow river. Willa spotted him midway across, her posture straightening with visible relief. "Hayes," she called, not bothering to hide her joy as he reached the far bank. "Thank God you're safe." "What are you doing here alone?" he demanded, dismounting beside her. "You should have gone with the others." "I convinced Father I would be safe enough waiting until dawn," she replied unapologetically. "Someone needed to guide you to the new camp. They're about 3 miles north." Hayes shook his head, both exasperated and touched by her stubbornness. "Davis and Young? Any sign of them?" "Not yet." Concern shadowed her features. "You were separated?" "Intentionally. It worked. Holloway's men split up to follow us." He glanced back across the river. "They may still make it back, or they might have found another crossing point." Willa nodded, accepting the uncertainty that came with their dangerous plan. "We should go. Father will be worried, and you look dead on your feet." Only then did Hayes become fully aware of his exhaustion. Nearly 24 hours without sleep, most of it spent in the saddle. He nodded wearily and remounted, following Willa as she led the way toward the wagon train's new position. Holloway himself was among the pursuers, he told her as they rode. "At least, I think it was him, man in a duster coat, giving orders to the others." Willa's expression hardened. "That would be Malcolm Reed, Holloway's enforcer. Holloway rarely leaves town himself, sends Reed to handle his dirty work." "Professional gunman?" "Worse. Former lawman turned corrupt." Her voice carried both disgust and fear. "He has a reputation for thoroughness. If he's leading the pursuit personally, Holloway is truly desperate to stop us." The information added urgency to their situation. Hayes knew the type. Men who wore badges long enough to learn how to work around the law, then sold those skills to whoever paid best. Such men were often more dangerous than common outlaws, combining cunning with the appearance of legitimacy. They reached the wagon train as full daylight spread across the landscape. Joseph rushed to meet them, embracing his daughter with visible relief before shaking Hayes's hand firmly. "You made it," the older man said, genuine gratitude in his voice. "We feared the worst when dawn came with no sign of any of you." "Davis and Young?" Hayes asked, though he already suspected the answer. Joseph's expression fell. "No sign yet. We've been watching the river, but—" Hayes nodded grimly. The two men had known the risks when they volunteered. He could only hope they'd found another way to safety, perhaps continuing east to the next settlement. "We should keep moving," he advised after accepting water and food from Martha. "Reed will regroup his men once he realizes they've been led astray. The river will slow them, but not stop them." Joseph agreed, and within the hour, the wagons were moving again, continuing their journey northward toward Fort Laramie. Hayes, despite his exhaustion, insisted on riding point, scanning the horizon for any sign of pursuit. Willa joined him mid-morning, bringing fresh coffee and quiet company. "You should rest," she suggested, noting his fatigue. "I can watch the trail for a few hours." Hayes shook his head stubbornly. "I'm fine." "You've been awake for over a day," she countered. "Even the best scout needs sleep." "When we make camp tonight," he promised, though they both knew it might prove a hollow commitment if danger threatened. Willa studied him for a long moment. "Why are you doing this, Hayes? Really doing this? You could have left us at any point, at the pass, during the night journey, certainly yesterday when you volunteered to stay behind. Yet here you are, still protecting people you claimed were just a temporary arrangement." The directness of her question, as always, caught him off guard. Hayes found himself searching for an answer that was both honest and safe. "I finish what I start," he said finally. I agreed to get you to Fort Laramie. Is that all? Her voice was gentle, but her eyes demanded honesty. Hayes looked away, uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. What more would there be? You tell me, Willa challenged. You're the one who's changed his patterns for us. For me, perhaps? The suggestion. After washing at the creek's edge, Hayes joined Joseph and Willa at their fire. Martha served a hearty stew with fresh-baked biscuits, the simple meal tasting like luxury after days of hardship. How far to Fort Laramie? Hayes asked between bites. 3 days at our current pace, Joseph replied. Less if we push harder, but the teams need recovery time after the forced march to the river. Hayes nodded understanding. No sign of pursuit since the river. We might have genuinely lost them. Or they might be taking another route, planning to intercept us closer to the fort, Willa suggested, ever practical. Possible, Hayes acknowledged, but increasingly difficult as we get farther from Holloway's territory. His influence diminishes with distance. Joseph looked thoughtful. What will you do once we reach Fort Laramie, Mr. Jordan? Continue your journey north. The question brought Hayes's uncertain future into sharp focus. His original plan, continuing north to Montana Territory, suddenly seemed less compelling than it had a week ago. The prospect of returning to his solitary existence after these days with the wagon train, with Willa, left a hollow feeling in his chest. I haven't decided, he answered honestly. My plans have become less certain. Willa glanced up from her plate, a question in her eyes that she didn't voice. Instead, she said, you would be welcome to continue with us to Cheyenne. The governor might even reward those who helped bring Holloway's crimes to light. I'm not looking for rewards, Hayes replied, perhaps more sharply than intended. Of course not, Joseph interjected smoothly. But a man of your abilities would be an asset wherever you choose to settle. Cheyenne is growing quickly. Opportunities abound for those willing to work. The suggestion of settlement, of putting down roots somewhere permanent, made Hayes instinctively uncomfortable. Yet he couldn't deny that something had shifted within him during this journey. The lone wolf existence he'd embraced for so long suddenly seemed less like protection and more like a prison of his own making. I'll consider it, he said finally, neither commitment nor refusal. The conversation shifted to other topics as they finished their meal. Eventually, Joseph excused himself to check on the other families, leaving Hayes and Willa alone by the fire. You don't have to decide tonight, she said after a comfortable silence. About Cheyenne, I mean. Hayes nodded, watching the flames dance among the logs. 6 years is a long time to wander without stopping. Sometimes I wonder if I remember how to stay in one place. I think it's like most skills, it comes back to you with practice. Her voice held no pressure, just quiet understanding. And you might find there are compensations for the freedom you'd surrender. Such as? He asked, genuinely curious about her perspective. Willa considered the question seriously. Belonging somewhere. Having people who know your name, your history. Building something that lasts beyond your own life. She paused, adding softly. Not having to say goodbye constantly. The simplicity of her answer resonated deeply with Hayes, touching the loneliness he'd refused to acknowledge for years. The prospect of belonging somewhere, to someone, stirred emotions he'd deliberately suppressed since losing his family. It's not that simple, he said, more to himself than to her. When you stay, you become vulnerable. People can find you, hurt you, or those you care about. That's true whether you stay or go, Willa observed. The difference is whether you face those risks alone or with others beside you. Before Hayes could respond, a shout came from the perimeter of the camp, a warning that immediately had him on his feet, hand moving to his revolver. One of the men on watch was pointing southward, where a solitary rider approached through the gathering darkness. Hayes moved quickly to intercept, Joseph and several other men joining him as they formed a defensive line between the approaching rider and the camp. As the figure drew nearer, however, Hayes felt a surge of relief. It's young, he called to the others. Hold your fire. The exhausted rider slumped in his saddle as he reached them, his horse nearly as spent as he was. Hayes and Joseph helped him dismount, supporting him toward the nearest fire as Martha hurried to bring water and food. Davis? Hayes asked once the man had drunk deeply. Young shook his head grimly. They got him. Shot him when we split up. I circled back when I heard the gunfire, but it was too late. The news settled heavily on the group. Davis had been well-liked, a family man with a wife and son among the travelers. His sacrifice would not be forgotten. Reed's men. Hayes pressed gently. Young nodded. They're persistent, I'll give them that. I lost my pursuers eventually, but not before seeing them regroup and continue following our original trail. They reached the river crossing about 6 hours after we did. Joseph looked alarmed. Then they could be close behind us now. Unlikely, Hayes assessed. They'd need to rest their horses after the chase yesterday and the river crossing today. But they're still coming, make no mistake. The information added renewed urgency to their journey. Despite the team's need for rest, they agreed to depart at first light and push harder toward Fort Laramie. Once within the protection of the military outpost, Holloway's men would be forced to abandon their pursuit. As the camp settled for the night, the mood was more subdued than before. Extra guards were posted, and families slept close together, aware that their ordeal was not yet over. Hayes found himself unable to rest despite his earlier exhaustion, choosing instead to walk the perimeter, checking on the guards and scanning the darkness beyond their fires. He found Willa similarly wakeful, sitting alone at the creek's edge, her knees drawn up to her chest as she stared at the water's gentle movement. You should sleep, he said quietly, stopping a respectful distance away. So should you, she countered without looking up. But here we both are. After a moment's hesitation, Hayes sat beside her, close but not touching. I'm sorry about Davis. He knew the risks. We all do. Her voice was steady, but Hayes could hear the sorrow beneath her composure. Does it get easier? Losing people? The question caught him by surprise. Not the inquiry itself, but the fact that she was asking him, acknowledging his experience with loss. No, he answered honestly. You just get better at carrying it. Willa nodded, accepting his truth. I keep thinking about his wife, his son, how to tell them that their husband and father died helping protect documents and maps. She shook her head. It seems so inadequate when measured against a human life. It's not just papers you're protecting, Hayes reminded her gently. It's justice for everyone Holloway has hurt or killed. It's the future of an entire community. I know, but in moments like this, the price feels very high. She turned to face him fully, moonlight silvering her features. Does it ever stop, Hayes? The violence, the death? Or is this just what the frontier will always be? People fighting and dying over land and gold and power? The question held no easy answer. Hayes had seen enough of the West to know that civilization's advance brought its own forms of corruption, often replacing the raw violence of the frontier with more sophisticated methods of exploitation. I don't know, he admitted. I've seen towns grow from nothing to something in a few years, some better, some worse. It depends on who builds them, I suppose. Who stays to make sure they grow right. People like my father, Willa said with quiet pride. People who believe in something beyond their own interests. Yes, Hayes agreed. And people like you. The compliment brought a small smile to her face. Perhaps people like you as well, if you decided to stop wandering. The suggestion hung between them. Neither pressure nor expectation, but an open door to a possibility Hayes hadn't allowed himself to consider in years. Before he could respond, she rose gracefully to her feet. We should both try to sleep, she said. Tomorrow will come early enough. Hayes watched her walk back toward the camp, her silhouette fading into the darkness between fires. Her question remained with him. Could he stop wandering, put down roots somewhere? The very thought had been anathema to him for so long that considering it now felt like contemplating a foreign language. Yet as he finally sought his own bedroll, Hayes found himself imagining what it might be like to wake each morning in the same place, to build something lasting, to have people who counted on his return, to have someone waiting for him. The next 2 days passed in a blur of dusty trails and watchful tension. The wagons made good time, pushing northward through increasingly rolling terrain. Young rode with Hayes on point, both men alert for any sign of pursuit, while Joseph organized regular rotation of drivers to maintain their pace despite fatigue. Willa divided her time between driving her father's wagon and riding alongside Hayes, their conversations becoming more comfortable as the miles passed beneath their horses' hooves. She told him about her mother, a Boston schoolteacher who had encouraged her love of reading and independent thinking. He shared stories of his brother Jacob, whose quick humor and steady presence had shaped Hayes's early years. These exchanges, simple yet profound, began to fill in the spaces between them, the history and experiences that had formed them both. With each revelation, each shared memory. The connection between them deepened beyond mere travel companionship or the forced intimacy of danger. By the evening of the second day, Fort Laramie was less than 24 hours ahead, close enough that the travelers allowed themselves to believe they might truly have escaped Holloway's reach. The camp that night was more relaxed. The insight struck uncomfortably close to Hayes's unacknowledged truth. He had indeed begun to transform during this journey, from lone wolf to reluctant protector, from a man defined by solitude to one increasingly drawn to connection. "What happens at Fort Laramie?" he asked, deliberately shifting the focus. "Once you're safely there." "We rest briefly, then continue to Cheyenne with military escort," she explained. "The evidence goes to the territorial governor, and legal proceedings begin against Holloway." Her expression became more serious. "It won't be quick or easy. He has resources and connections, but it's a start toward justice." "And after that, you return to Redemption Creek." Willa shook her head. "Not immediately. Too dangerous until Holloway is formally charged. Father has connections in Cheyenne. We'll stay there while the case proceeds." She paused, adding carefully, "There would be opportunities for someone with your skills in a growing city like Cheyenne." The implication was clear, though delicately phrased. She was offering him a reason to continue with them beyond Fort Laramie, beyond his stated commitment. A reason to consider ending his wandering ways. Before Hayes could respond, Joseph approached, his expression troubled. "Hayes, Young thinks he saw movement on the ridge to the south. Could be nothing, but..." Hayes was immediately alert, setting aside his half-finished meal. "I'll check it. Keep everyone close to the wagons." As he moved away, he felt Willa's gaze following him, a tangible weight of concern and something more complex. The conversation they'd been approaching would have to wait, postponed yet again by the threat of danger. Hayes joined Young at the southern perimeter, following the man's gesture toward a distant ridgeline barely visible in the moonlight. For several minutes, they watched in silence, seeing nothing unusual. Then, just as Hayes was about to dismiss the concern, a brief flash appeared. Moonlight reflecting off metal, perhaps a rifle barrel or spyglass. "They found us," Hayes confirmed grimly. "Question is, are they planning to attack tonight or follow us closer to the fort?" Young grimaced. "If it were me, I'd hit before dawn. Catch everyone sleeping, create maximum confusion." Hayes nodded agreement. "Get back to camp. Tell Joseph to break down everything quietly. No lights beyond what's absolutely necessary. We move in 1 hour." "In the dark?" Young asked incredulously. "The trail's treacherous enough by daylight." "We can't defend this position effectively," Hayes explained. "Too exposed. Our best chance is to get closer to the fort before they attack. If we can reach the North Platte crossing, we'd have better defensive options." Young hurried back to relay the instructions while Hayes continued observing the distant ridge, mentally calculating distances and timing. If Reed's men attacked tonight, the wagon train would be dangerously vulnerable. If they could get moving quietly, however, they might buy crucial hours of travel time before their pursuers realized they'd departed. The camp transformed with remarkable efficiency, families packing quickly and silently under Joseph's direction. Children were settled into wagons, fires banked, and teams hitched with minimal conversation. Within the hour, they were ready to move. Hayes rode back to the main group, impressed by their discipline. "Single file, keep close," he instructed. "No lanterns. Follow the wagon ahead of you. Young will lead. I'll ride rear guard." Joseph nodded understanding. "And if they attack during movement?" "Circle the wagons immediately. Defend from behind the wheels." Hayes checked his weapons one final time. "But with luck, they won't realize we've gone until first light." As the wagons began moving out, Willa approached on horseback, a rifle across her saddle. "I'll ride with you," she stated, her tone brooking no argument. "The rear is the most dangerous position if they follow," Hayes countered. "Exactly why you shouldn't be alone." She adjusted her hat determinedly. "I'm a good shot, Hayes. Better than most of the men here." He studied her in the dim light, recognizing both the skill and the stubbornness in her claim. After a moment's consideration, he nodded. "Stay close. If trouble comes, you ride for the wagons immediately. No heroics." Her smile flashed briefly. "I could say the same to you." They fell in behind the last wagon as the train began its cautious nighttime journey. Progress was painfully slow on the unfamiliar trail, each wagon picking its way carefully to avoid ruts and obstacles that could cause delays or damage. Hayes estimated they were moving at less than half their normal pace, but still faster than standing still awaiting attack. For 2 hours, they continued without incident. The only sounds the creak of wagon wheels and the occasional soft command to the teams. The moon provided just enough light to navigate, while the rolling terrain offered some concealment from distant observers. Hayes remained hyper-alert, constantly scanning their backtrail for signs of pursuit. Beside him, Willa maintained similar vigilance, her posture straight despite the late hour and tension. "You should be with your father," he said softly during a particularly dark stretch. "He has Martha and Young," she replied without hesitation. "You had no one." The simple statement, "You had no one," struck Hayes with unexpected force. How long had it been since anyone had concerned themselves with his welfare? Since anyone had chosen to remain with him rather than seeking their own safety? "I'm accustomed to being alone," he said, though the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. "That doesn't make it right or necessary." Willa's voice was gentle but firm, especially now. Before Hayes could respond, a distant sound caught his attention, the faint whinny of a horse, quickly hushed from somewhere behind them. He raised a hand for silence, straining to hear above the creak of the wagons ahead. There it was again, the soft jingle of tack, the muffled thud of hooves on packed earth. They were being followed, and their pursuers were closing the distance. "Right ahead," he instructed Willa urgently. "Tell Young to increase speed. They're behind us." For once, she didn't argue, spurring her horse forward along the line of wagons. Hayes held his position, calculating distances and options. The North Platte crossing was still several hours ahead, too far to reach before their pursuers caught up. They would need to find defensive positions sooner. He squinted at the surrounding landscape, barely visible in the moonlight. To the west, a dark line suggested a change in terrain, perhaps a creek bed or low bluff. It might offer some protection, better than the open trail they currently traveled. Willa returned within minutes, her voice low but urgent. "Young says there's a trading post about 2 miles ahead, abandoned last year, but the buildings are still standing. Father thinks we should make for it." Hayes considered this new information. An abandoned trading post would offer solid walls and defensible positions, far better than anything the open countryside provided. "Tell them to push hard for it," he decided. "I'll stay back, try to slow the pursuit." Willa's expression hardened. "Alone? Against how many?" "I counted at least 6 horses. Maybe more." Hayes checked his revolver, ensuring each chamber was loaded. "Go, Willa. The wagons need warning if I can't hold them back." She hesitated, clearly torn between duty to the travelers and reluctance to leave Hayes facing overwhelming odds. Finally, she reached into her saddlebag and extracted a small Derringer pistol, offering it to him. "Take this. Extra firepower." Her eyes held his intently. "And come back, Hayes Jordan." "That's not a request." He accepted the small weapon, tucking it into his vest pocket. "Yes, ma'am." With a final searching look, Willa turned her horse and galloped forward to rejoin the wagons. Hayes watched until she disappeared into the darkness before focusing his attention on the approaching riders. They were closer now, perhaps half a mile back, still advancing cautiously but with growing confidence as they followed the wagon train's trail. Hayes guided his horse off the path and into a shallow depression where the moonlight cast deep shadows. His strategy was simple: create uncertainty about the wagon train's defenses, possibly delay the pursuit by forcing caution. A direct confrontation would be suicidal, but a few well-placed shots might convince Reed that his quarry was better prepared than expected. The riders approached steadily, their forms gradually becoming more distinct in the pale moonlight. Hayes counted 8 men, with Reed's distinctive duster coat visible at their center. They rode in loose formation, rifles at the ready, but moving with the confidence of predators who believed their prey was unaware of their presence. Hayes waited until they were within reliable rifle range before taking careful aim at the ground directly in front of the lead rider. His shot cracked through the night air, kicking up dirt and startling the horses. Immediately, the riders scattered for cover, shouting in confusion. Hayes fired twice more, deliberately missing but creating enough threat to force them to dismount and seek shelter behind rocks and uneven ground. Then he wheeled his horse and galloped away, taking a route parallel to the wagon train's path, but leading slightly away from it. a false trail to draw pursuit. Behind him, he heard Reed shouting orders. 2 riders mounted again, following Hayes's direction, while the others presumably continued along the wagon train's original path. The diversion had worked, but only partially. Reed had split his forces rather than abandoning the main pursuit. Hayes pushed his horse hard, staying just visible enough to keep the 2 followers in. "Reed can go to hell," the wounded man snarled. "This bastard shot me, and I'll shoot you again if you don't shut up," the scarred man replied irritably. "Tie his hands. We're taking him back." As the wounded man approached with a length of rope, Hayes assessed his options. Both men had guns trained on him, but the injured man was unsteady, his attention divided between his wound and his captive. If Hayes moved quickly, the decision was made for him when a shot rang out from the darkness, striking the scarred man's arm. As he cried out in surprise, Hayes lunged forward, tackling the wounded man and driving him to the ground. They struggled briefly before Hayes landed a solid blow that left his opponent unconscious. He rolled away, grabbing for the fallen man's revolver, only to find the scarred captor already recovering, swinging his weapon toward Hayes with murderous intent. Before either could fire, another shot cracked through the night, and the scarred man collapsed, a look of surprise frozen on his face. Willa stepped from the shadows, rifle still raised. "I told you not to be heroic," she said, though her attempted lightness was betrayed by the slight tremor in her voice. Hayes stared at her in disbelief. "What are you doing here? You were supposed to stay with the wagons. And you were supposed to come back," she countered, lowering her rifle. "When you didn't, I came looking." Her gaze shifted to his unconscious opponent and the dead man nearby. "It seems I arrived just in time." Hayes couldn't argue with her assessment, though the risk she'd taken still filled him with a mixture of gratitude and concern. The others? The trading post. Secured and defensible. Father has everyone inside the main building. Reed and his remaining men arrived shortly after I left to find you. She moved closer, examining him for injuries. They're keeping their distance for now, probably waiting for these 2 to report back. Hayes nodded understanding. "We need to move quickly, then. My horse is injured. Can't carry both of us." "Mine is tied about 50 yards back," Willa replied. "But we'll have to circle wide to avoid Reed's men on the direct approach to the post." As they collected weapons from the fallen men and prepared to depart, Hayes found himself studying Willa with new eyes. She had risked everything to come after him. A man who had repeatedly insisted he worked alone, needed no one, would leave them at Fort Laramie regardless of circumstances. "Why did you come for me?" he asked as they moved through the trees toward her waiting horse. Willa paused, turning to face him in the dappled moonlight filtering through the branches. For once, her direct gaze faltered slightly. "Because I couldn't bear the thought of you facing them alone," she admitted softly. "Because somewhere between Redemption Creek and here, you became more than just our guide or protector. You became," she hesitated, then finished simply, "important." The word hung between them, laden with unspoken meaning. Hayes found himself at a rare loss for response, the walls he'd maintained for so long crumbling beneath the weight of her honest admission. "Willa, he began, only to be interrupted by the distant sound of gunfire from the direction of the trading post. "They're attacking," she said urgently. "We need to go." The moment shattered, they hurried to her horse. Hayes helped her mount, then swung up behind her. The animal protested briefly at the double burden before responding to Willa's sure handling. They rode in tense silence, following a circuitous route that would bring them to the trading post from the north, opposite Reed's known position. The gunfire continued sporadically, suggesting probing attacks rather than an all-out assault. As they approached, the abandoned trading post came into clearer view, a main building with attached storeroom, a separate stable, and what appeared to be a blacksmith shed, all arranged in a rough square around a central yard. Reed's men had taken positions behind scattered barrels and wagons abandoned when the post closed, while occasional muzzle flashes from the building's windows showed where the defenders were holding their ground. "We need a distraction," Hayes murmured, studying the layout. "Something to draw their attention while we make a run for the main entrance." Willa pointed toward the stable. "There's dry hay inside. If we could set it alight." Hayes nodded approval. "Bold, but effective. Can you circle around to approach from the east? I'll create the diversion, then make for the main door when they're distracted." For a moment, He thought she might argue against their separation. Instead, she reached into her pocket and pressed something into his hand, a small photograph in a tarnished metal frame. "For luck," she whispered. "Come back this time. Please." Before he could respond, she urged the horse forward, circling wide to approach the stable from the least exposed angle. Hayes watched her go, then glanced down at the object in his hand. In the dim light, he could just make out the image, a younger Willa standing beside her father in front of what must be the newly opened Delacroix Hotel. The simple gesture touched him deeply. He carefully tucked the photograph into his vest pocket, next to the derringer she'd given him earlier, before moving stealthily toward his position. Approaching the stable required crossing open ground, but Reed's men were focused on the main building, their attention directed away from Hayes's route. He reached the structure undetected and slipped inside through a partially collapsed wall. The interior was dark but navigable, stalls lining both sides of a central aisle. As Willa had indicated, there was indeed dry hay piled in several of the stalls, perfect tinder for a fire that would create both light and confusion. Hayes worked quickly, gathering hay into a large pile near the building's front. Using matches from his pocket, he set the dry material ablaze, then retreated toward the rear of the stable as flames caught and spread rapidly. The effect was immediate. Shouts of alarm came from Reed's men as they noticed the growing fire. Several broke cover, moving toward the stable with clear intent to prevent the blaze from spreading to their own positions. Hayes used their distraction to slip out the back of the stable and circle toward the main building. Across the yard, he caught a glimpse of Willa doing the same from the opposite direction, both converging on the trading post's front entrance. The defenders had noticed the fire as well. Hayes saw the main door open slightly, Joseph Delacroix visible in the narrow gap as he prepared to admit the returning pair. Hayes was halfway across the open space when one of Reed's men spotted him, shouting a warning. Gunfire erupted, bullets striking the dirt around him as he sprinted for the doorway. He returned fire with his revolver, providing covering shots as Willa made her own dash toward safety. They reached the door almost simultaneously, Joseph pulling them inside as bullets splintered the wooden frame around them. The heavy door slammed shut behind them, securing them within the relative safety of the trading post's thick walls. "Thank God," Joseph breathed, embracing his daughter briefly before turning to Hayes. "We feared the worst when you didn't return. Your daughter found me," Hayes replied, still catching his breath. "Saved my life, in fact." Around them, the other travelers watched with expressions ranging from relief to concern. Hayes considered their options, none of them good. "We need to extinguish that fire from outside. Or," his gaze moved to the attached storeroom where the wagon teams were kept. "Or we create our own exit strategy." Understanding dawned in Joseph's expression. "The wagons. We could break through the rear wall of the storeroom, away from where they've set the fire." "Exactly. Load everyone and break out at speed. Head directly for Fort Laramie, without stopping." Hayes was already moving toward the storeroom. "We'll need everyone's help to clear a path through that wall quickly." The plan came together with remarkable efficiency. While some maintained defense at the windows, others used axes and tools found within the trading post to begin dismantling the storeroom's rear wall. The teams were hitched to the wagons, loaded with essential supplies and the all-important documents. As dawn approached, the smoke inside the building had become increasingly difficult to bear, with women and children covering their faces with damp cloths. The wall, however, was nearly breached, a section large enough for wagons to pass through opening onto open country beyond. "Everyone to their wagons," Joseph directed as the final boards were pulled away. "Women and children inside, men ready to defend. We move all at once, as fast as the teams can run." Hayes positioned himself at the lead wagon, which Joseph would drive. "I'll ride ahead, draw fire if needed. Young takes rear guard. No stopping for anything until we reach the fort." As the travelers took their positions, Hayes found Willa preparing to mount her horse alongside his. "What are you doing?" he demanded. "You should be in your father's wagon." "I ride with you," she stated firmly. "We break through together." There was no time to argue, and in truth, Hayes found he didn't want to. The prospect of facing what came next with Willa beside him felt right in a way he couldn't articulate. "Stay close," he instructed. "And if I say ride for the fort, you do it without question." Her smile was brief but genuine. We'll see. The escape was executed with precision born of desperation. As the first rays of sunlight crept over the eastern horizon, the wagons burst through the opening simultaneously, teams at full gallop as they charged away from the trading post. Reed's men, caught by surprise at the unexpected direction of escape, scrambled to mount their horses and give chase. Gunfire erupted, mostly wild shots that did little damage as the wagons quickly gained distance across the open terrain. Hayes and Willa rode ahead, pushing their horses to maintain the lead position. Behind them, the wagons formed a tight line, drivers urging their teams to maximum speed despite the rough ground. For nearly an hour, they maintained this breakneck pace, gradually pulling away from their pursuers. The rising sun revealed the landscape more clearly, including a welcome sight in the distance, the distinctive outline of Fort Laramie's walls. "We're going to make it," Willa breathed, her face flushed with exertion and hope. "They're falling behind." Hayes nodded, allowing himself to believe she might be right. Reed's men had indeed dropped back, their horses winded after the long night and unexpected chase. The fort was still distant but clearly visible now, perhaps 2 hours' hard travel away. Their relief was premature. As they crested a small rise, Hayes spotted new riders approaching from the east, at least 4 men, moving to intercept their path. "Reinforcements," he growled. "Reed must have sent for them yesterday, anticipating a chase." Willa's expression hardened with determination. "We've come too far to be stopped now." Hayes signaled to Joseph, warning of the new threat ahead. The wagons adjusted course slightly, angling northwest to avoid immediate interception, but the geographical reality was inescapable. They would have to pass through a narrow valley before reaching the fort, and the approaching riders were positioning to control that passage. "We need to clear that valley entrance before they secure it," Hayes decided. "Otherwise the wagons will be trapped with enemies on both sides." Willa understood immediately. "We ride ahead. Draw them away from the valley entrance long enough for the wagons to pass through." Hayes nodded, though concern for her safety twisted in his gut. "It's dangerous. These won't be ordinary ranch hands. Reed would have sent his best for reinforcements. All the more reason we face them together," she replied with simple logic. 2 guns are better than 1. There was no time for further discussion. They spurred their horses forward, separating from the wagon train to approach the valley entrance from a wide angle. As expected, the newcomers adjusted their course to intercept them, exactly as Hayes had hoped. "Ride hard for that rock formation," he instructed, pointing to a cluster of boulders near the valley's mouth. "We'll make our stand there. Hold them off as long as possible." They reached the rocks minutes before the approaching riders, dismounting quickly and securing their horses behind the natural barrier. Hayes positioned himself with a clear view of both the oncoming threat and the wagon train's approach, rifle ready. "Remember," he told Willa as she took position beside him, "our goal is to delay them, not defeat them. Once the wagons are through the valley, we mount up and follow." She nodded understanding, her expression focused and determined. There was no fear in her eyes, only calm readiness that impressed Hayes deeply. In that moment, he realized with perfect clarity that his feelings for Willa Delacroix had grown far beyond admiration or attraction. Somewhere between Redemption Creek and this desperate last stand, he had fallen in love with her. The revelation should have terrified him. Love was the very attachment he'd avoided for years, the vulnerability he'd sworn never to allow himself again. Instead, he felt an unexpected sense of peace, as though a question he hadn't known he was asking had finally been answered. "Willa," he began, suddenly desperate to tell her before whatever came next. "I need you to know, they're coming," she interrupted, raising her rifle. 4 riders, well armed. The approaching men had indeed closed the distance, spreading out to approach the rocky position from multiple angles. Hayes shifted his focus, setting aside personal revelations for the more immediate challenge of survival. "Wait for my shot," he instructed, sighting down his rifle at the lead rider. "Make each bullet count." When they were within clear range, Hayes fired. His target jerked in the saddle but remained mounted, returning fire as he sought cover. The exchange quickly escalated, bullets striking rock around them as they returned carefully aimed shots. From the corner of his eye, Hayes could see the wagon train approaching the valley entrance, Joseph driving the lead vehicle at full speed, the others close behind. The plan was working. Their diversion had drawn the reinforcements away from the critical passage. One of the attackers fell as Willa's shot found its mark, reducing their immediate opposition. The remaining 3 became more cautious, circling to approach from less exposed angles. Hayes adjusted his position, aware that their defensive advantage would soon be compromised. "The wagons are nearly through," Willa reported, quickly reloading her rifle. "Another few minutes." Hayes nodded, his attention divided between their immediate threat and the wagon train's progress. What he saw troubled him deeply. Reed's original pursuit had caught up, approaching the valley from the south. The wagons would soon be caught between 2 forces. "Change of plans," he said grimly. "The wagons need more time. Joseph will have to fight his way through." Willa followed his gaze, understanding immediately. "We need to deal with these 3 quickly, then help the wagons." As if in answer to her assessment, the attackers launched a coordinated rush toward their position, apparently having reached the same conclusion about timing. Hayes and Willa fired rapidly, forcing them back temporarily, but not before one bullet grazed Hayes's arm, tearing through his sleeve and leaving a burning line across his skin. "You're hit," Willa said, concern evident despite her continued focus on their attackers. "It's nothing," Hayes replied, though the wound stung fiercely. "Just a scratch." They maintained their defense as the wagon train entered the valley, Joseph driving with determined speed while the men provided covering fire against Reed's approaching force. The situation was rapidly deteriorating into exactly what Hayes had hoped to avoid: a direct confrontation with women and children caught in the crossfire. A decision crystallized in his mind. The wagons needed a clear path to the fort, which meant eliminating the threat at the valley's far end. Someone would need to ride ahead, engage Reed's men directly while the train passed through. "Willa," he said, his voice calm despite the gravity of his intent, "I need you to get back to the wagons. Help them fight through the valley while I deal with these 3. She turned sharply, reading his true purpose in his expression. "That's not the plan, Hayes. We stay together. Plans change." He reloaded his revolver with steady hands. "The wagons need you more than I do right now. And after you deal with these 3, she challenged. "You're planning something foolish. I can see it in your eyes." Hayes couldn't deny her accusation. "Reed needs to be stopped. Permanently. Or he'll keep coming. All the way to Cheyenne if necessary." Understanding dawned in her expression. "You're going after Reed himself." "Someone has to end this," Hayes confirmed. "The wagons can reach the fort if the path is clear. I can make it clear." "At what cost?" Willa demanded, though her voice remained low enough not to carry to. "As was my daughter, apparently," Joseph observed, his gaze shifting to where Willa was speaking with Captain Bennett, presumably explaining their situation and the importance of the documents they carried. "She told me about riding out to find you last night. A reckless decision that likely saved your life." Hayes couldn't deny it. "She's remarkable. You raised her well. I can claim little credit." Willa has always known her own mind. Joseph studied Hayes thoughtfully. "The question now is whether you know yours, Mr. Jordan." The directness of the older man's question caught Hayes off guard. "Sir, my daughter cares for you," Joseph stated plainly. "That much is obvious to anyone with eyes. What's less clear is whether you're willing to abandon your solitary ways for something more permanent." The conversation was interrupted as military personnel ushered them toward the fort's main building, where arrangements were being made for the travelers' accommodation and care. Hayes found himself separated from Joseph, the question hanging unanswered between them. The next hours passed in a blur of activity: medical attention for minor injuries, statements given to fort officials, arrangements made for the continuing journey to Cheyenne. Hayes moved through these necessities mechanically, his mind preoccupied with Joseph's question and his own unresolved feelings. By evening, the travelers were settled in quarters provided by the fort, enjoying their first truly secure rest since leaving Redemption Creek. A celebratory meal was arranged in the mess hall, with officers joining the civilians in recognition of their ordeal and success. Hayes found himself seated beside Willa, who had changed into a clean dress borrowed from an officer's wife. Her hair was neatly arranged, though a few stubborn strands had already escaped their pins. The simple transformation from trail-worn rider to composed young woman reminded Hayes of their first meeting. Had it really been only a week ago? "Captain Bennett says we'll have military escort all the way to Cheyenne," she informed him between bites of the first proper meal they'd had in days. Reed won't trouble us further with those odds against him. Hayes nodded agreement. And the documents? Safe. Father's already written preliminary statements for the territorial officials. She studied him over her water glass. Now we need only decide what comes next. The deliberate ambiguity of her statement wasn't lost on Hayes. Did she mean the journey to Cheyenne? Or something more personal, the unfinished conversation from the trading post, perhaps? I've been thinking about that, he admitted. What comes next, I mean? Willa set down her glass, giving him her full attention. And have you reached any conclusions, Mr. Jordan? The formality of her address contrasted with the intimate nature of their shared experiences, creating a tension Hayes found both uncomfortable and strangely compelling. They were balanced on the edge of something significant, a moment of decision neither could avoid any longer. I have, he said finally. But this isn't the place for that discussion. Too many years. Understanding filled her expression. After dinner, then. The officers have arranged a small garden space for relaxation. It should be quiet enough for private conversation. Hayes nodded agreement, relieved and anxious in equal measure. The meal concluded with speeches from Captain Bennett and Joseph, both praising the courage and determination of all involved in bringing Holloway's corruption to light. Throughout these formalities, Hayes found himself acutely aware of Willa beside him. Her proximity, her scent, the occasional brush of her skirt against his leg as she shifted in her chair. When the gathering finally dispersed, she led him through corridors to the promised garden, a small, enclosed space with benches and carefully tended plants that seemed incongruously civilized after their recent wilderness ordeal. The evening air was cool but pleasant, stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky above. They sat side by side on a stone bench, close but not touching. For several minutes, neither spoke. The silence between them weighted with unspoken thoughts and feelings. At the trading post, Hayes finally began. Before the reinforcements arrived, I was trying to tell you something. Willa turned slightly toward him, her expression open yet guarded. I remember. Hayes found himself searching for words adequate to express the transformation he'd undergone. For 6 years, I believed that staying alone was the only way to survive. That attachments were dangerous, fatal, even. I convinced myself that the loneliness was worth the safety. He paused, gathering his thoughts. Then I met you. Stubborn, direct, fearless you. And everything I thought I knew about survival started to unravel. How so? Willa asked softly, though her eyes suggested she already knew the answer. You showed me that sometimes safety isn't worth the cost. That connection, real connection, might be worth the risk after all. Hayes met her gaze directly. I've spent years running from the possibility of loss, only to discover I've been losing something valuable every day I spent alone. Willa's breath caught slightly. And what was that? The chance to truly live, to build something lasting. Hayes reached for her hand, surprised to find his own trembling slightly. To love someone who might actually love me back. The word hung between them. Love, so simple, yet so profound. Willa's fingers tightened around his, her eyes bright with emotion. Is that what you're saying, Hayes Jordan? That you love me? Her voice was steady despite the weight of the question. Yes, he answered without hesitation. I love you, Willa Delacroix. Against all my better judgment, despite every rule I set for myself. I love your courage, your honesty, your unwavering sense of justice. I love that you came looking for me when I didn't return, that you challenge every wall I try to build. A single tear escaped down her cheek, though her smile was radiant. It's about time you admitted it. I've been waiting since Devil's Pass for you to catch up to what I already knew. Hayes laughed softly, the sound unfamiliar, yet liberating. Was I that transparent? To everyone but yourself, I think. She reached up to touch his face gently. For a man so observant of terrain and threats, you were remarkably blind to your own heart. That's changing, he promised. I can't say I won't struggle. 6 years of habits won't disappear overnight. But I know what I want now, with a clarity I haven't felt since before I lost my family. And what is that? Willa asked, though her expression suggested she already knew the answer. A life with you, Hayes said simply. In Cheyenne, or wherever you choose to build your future. Not just until Fort Laramie, or until the documents reach the governor. For as long as you'll have me. Willa's smile widened. That might be a very long time, Mr. Jordan. I'm not known for changing my mind once it's set. I'm counting on that, he replied, gathering his courage for the final step. Which is why I'm asking if you'd consider making it permanent. Marry me, Willa. Be my partner in whatever comes next. Her answer was immediate and unhesitating. Yes. 1,000 times, yes. The distance between them closed naturally, their lips meeting in a kiss that felt like both culmination and beginning. Hayes cradled her face gently, pouring 6 years of suppressed emotion into the connection, tenderness, passion, and the profound relief of finally coming home. When they eventually parted, Willa rested her forehead against his, her voice soft but certain. The cowboy who said never just promised forever. Hayes smiled, the irony not lost on him. And I've never meant anything more in my life. My father will be pleased, she added with a hint of mischief. He's been dropping increasingly unsubtle hints about you since we left Redemption Creek. I noticed, Hayes admitted. He asked me quite directly this afternoon whether I intended to abandon my solitary ways. And now you have your answer for him. Willa stood, drawing him up with her. Shall we tell him together? Hayes rose, keeping her hand firmly in his. Together. That has a nice sound to it. As they walked back toward the fort's main buildings, Hayes reflected on the remarkable journey that had brought him to this moment. A week ago, he had been a man committed to isolation, convinced that attachment only led to loss. Now he walked hand in hand with a woman who had shown him that some risks were worth taking, that love could exist even in the harsh realities of frontier life. The following morning, with Joseph's blessing enthusiastically given, they announced their engagement to the travel party. The news was met with congratulations and knowing smiles. Apparently, as Willa had suggested, their developing feelings had been obvious to everyone but Hayes himself. Captain Bennett arranged for a military chaplain to perform the ceremony before their departure for Cheyenne, suggesting that traveling as husband and wife would be both more proper and more secure. Neither Hayes nor Willa saw reason to wait, their recent brush with mortality having reinforced the preciousness of time. 3 days later, in the fort's small chapel, Hayes Jordan married Willa Delacroix before their fellow travelers and several interested officers. She wore a borrowed dress of pale blue, her wheat gold hair adorned with wildflowers gathered by the children of the wagon train. Hayes, in his cleanest shirt and a borrowed jacket, found himself unexpectedly moved by the simple ceremony that formalized what his heart already knew. I never thought I'd see this day, he confessed quietly as they exchanged rings, simple bands purchased from the Fort Sutler. A permanent home, a wife, a future beyond mere survival. Willa's eyes shone with happiness, and I never doubted it would come. From the moment